The champagne glass trembled in my hand as my brother Marcus's voice cut through the funeral reception like a blade. Let's be honest, Sophia. Grandfather barely knew you existed. You think you deserve half of everything he built? The mourners around us fell silent, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they turned to witness what was about to unfold. I stood there in my simple black dress from Target, surrounded by relatives in designer mourning attire, feeling like an intruder at my own grandfather's funeral. But Marcus had no idea what was coming. He had no idea about the envelope that had arrived at my apartment 3 days ago, sealed with red wax and bearing my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. He had no idea that everything he thought he knew about our family's fortune was about to change forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sophia Elena Castillo, and for 28 years, I believed I was the forgotten granddaughter. The one who didn't quite fit into the pristine world of old money and social expectations that my family inhabited like a second skin. While my brother Marcus glided effortlessly through private schools, country club events, and business networking dinners, I spent my childhood feeling like I was watching their lives through frosted glass, always on the outside looking in. Growing up in the sprawling Castillo estate in Napa Valley should have been a fairy tale, but it felt more like living in a beautiful prison where I was constantly reminded that I didn't belong. The house itself was a testament to generations of winemaking success, with its Mediterranean architecture, terraced vineyards stretching toward the horizon, and walls lined with portraits of ancestors who all seemed to share the same confident gaze that Marcus had inherited. I used to study those portraits for hours, searching for any resemblance to myself, any sign that I truly belonged to this legacy. My grandfather, Eduardo Castillo, was the patriarch of our family's wine empire. Castillo Vineyards had been in our family for over a century, growing from a small family operation into one of California's most prestigious wineries. Eduardo was a man of few words but immense presence. When he spoke, even the most powerful business leaders in Napa Valley listened. He had built his fortune not just on exceptional wine, but on intuitive understanding of people and business that bordered on the mystical. But to me, he always seemed distant. While Marcus received weekly invitations to join him for morning walks through the vineyards, business meetings in his oak-paneled study, and trips to wine options in France, I was relegated to awkward holiday conversations and stilted birthday phone calls. My parents, David and Isabella Castillo, made it clear through 1,000 small actions that Marcus was the heir apparent, while I was expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention came my way. The difference in treatment was so stark that I sometimes wondered if I was adopted, though my reflection in the mirror told a different story. I had Eduardo's distinctive amber eyes and the same stubborn chin that appeared in oil paintings throughout the house. But somehow, that physical resemblance never translated into emotional connection or inclusion in family business discussions. Marcus, 3 years older than I, seemed to absorb our parents' favoritism like sunlight, growing more confident and entitled with each passing year. He attended Stanford for business, naturally, while I fought for every penny of my community college tuition. He drove a BMW that was a graduation gift, while I worked double shifts at a local coffee shop to afford my used Honda Civic. When he started his MBA at Wharton, the family celebrated with a dinner party at the estate. When I graduated with honors from my teaching program, I received a card with a $50 gift certificate to a chain restaurant. The pattern was so consistent that I eventually stopped hoping for anything different. I moved to a small apartment in Sonoma, 45 minutes from the family estate, and threw myself into building a life that didn't depend on their approval or recognition. I became a high school English teacher, pouring my heart into helping teenagers discover the power of storytelling and critical thinking. My students became my chosen family, and their successes felt more meaningful than any family dinner ever had. For 5 years, I maintained a careful distance from the Castillo world. I attended the obligatory holiday gatherings and family events, playing my role as the dutiful but unremarkable daughter and granddaughter. I watched Marcus take increasingly prominent roles in the family business, his face appearing in wine industry magazines and local newspapers as he was groomed to eventually take over the empire. Our parents beamed with pride at every mention of his accomplishments, while my teaching career was treated as a quaint hobby rather than a meaningful profession. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had always been the one who actually loved the vineyards. As a child, I would sneak out early in the morning to walk among the grapevines, watching the sunrise over the valley and breathing in the rich scent of earth and growing things. I knew the names of every varietal we grew, understood the subtle differences between the terroir of our different vineyard blocks, and could identify the vintage of our wines by taste alone. But my knowledge was dismissed as cute rather than valuable, while Marcus's business acumen was celebrated even though he could barely tell a Cabernet from a Merlot without reading the label. This dynamic had been so established for so long that I barely registered it anymore. It was simply the way things were in the Castillo family. Marcus was the golden child, the heir, the future of everything Eduardo had built. I was the afterthought, the consolation prize, the daughter who had failed to live up to expectations I was never clear about in the first place. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in October when I received the phone call that Eduardo had died peacefully in his sleep. The news hit me harder than I expected. Despite our distant relationship, he had been a constant presence in my life, a figure of stability and strength, even if that strength had never been directed toward nurturing our connection. I found myself crying not just for his death, but for all the conversations we never had, all the moments of connection I had always hoped might someday materialize. The funeral was held 3 days later at St. Helena Catholic Church, the same church where Eduardo had married my grandmother 62 years ago. The service was standing room only, filled with business associates, political figures, charity board members, and celebrities who had become friends through Eduardo's involvement in various social causes. Marcus delivered a perfect eulogy, speaking eloquently about Eduardo's business legacy, his commitment to excellence, and his dedication to family. I listened from the third row, surrounded by cousins and extended family members who offered me polite smiles and generic condolences. After the burial at the family cemetery on the estate grounds, everyone returned to the house for the traditional reception. The catering staff had transformed the main house into an elegant gathering space with floral arrangements that must have cost more than my monthly salary and enough premium wine to stock a small restaurant. I found myself gravitating toward the edges of the crowd, making small talk with distant relatives and family friends, while Marcus held court in the center of the room, accepting condolences and business cards with equal grace. That's when it happened. I was standing near the large windows that overlooked the vineyards, holding a glass of wine I hadn't touched, when Marcus approached me with several of his business school friends and a few family members in tow. His face had that particular expression I remembered from childhood, the one that meant he was about to assert his dominance in a way that would leave me feeling small and insignificant. The small group around us had grown quiet, clearly anticipating some form of entertainment at my expense. I took a small sip of wine, hoping the alcohol might provide some liquid courage for whatever was about to unfold. "Oh," I managed to say, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "Well, we were just discussing the future of the business, and your name came up." I felt my stomach tighten, sensing that whatever was coming next would be humiliating. The small group around us had grown quiet, clearly anticipating some form of entertainment at my expense. I took a small sip of wine, hoping the alcohol might provide some liquid courage for whatever was about to unfold. "Oh," I managed to say, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "Well, we were just discussing the future of the business, and your name came up." His friend, James, whom I remembered as being particularly obnoxious during their Stanford years, chuckled.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Exactly. No offense, Sophia, but teaching high school isn't exactly preparation for running a multi-million-dollar wine operation. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I forced myself to remain calm. I never said I wanted to run the business, Marcus. Good, he said, his smile growing wider. Because honestly, let's be realistic here. Grandfather barely knew you existed. You think you deserve half of everything he built? You haven't been involved in the business, you don't understand the industry, and you've spent the last 5 years barely staying in touch with the family. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to remind me of my position as the family outsider. I looked around at the faces surrounding us, seeing expressions that ranged from uncomfortable embarrassment to barely concealed amusement. No one stepped forward to defend me or suggest that Marcus was being inappropriate at our grandfather's funeral reception. I think, I said quietly, that Eduardo's will should speak for itself when it's read. Marcus laughed, a sound that carried no warmth. Oh, Sophia! Sweet, naive Sophia! You really think he was going to leave the family business to someone who teaches teenagers about Shakespeare? Come on, this is the real world. This is about legacy, about continuing what he built, about making sure Castillo Inyards thrives for another 100 years. He gestured broadly, encompassing the room full of mourners, the elegant house, the vineyards visible through the windows. You think he was going to risk all of this on someone who can barely manage their own finances? The insult about my finances stung particularly sharply because it was based on assumptions rather than facts. Marcus had no idea that I had been carefully saving money for years, that I had investments and retirement accounts, that I had built a modest but stable financial foundation for myself. But his perception of me as financially incompetent was apparently shared by the family, just another way in which I was deemed unsuitable for their world. Besides, Marcus continued, clearly enjoying the audience he had attracted, what would you even do with a wine business? Turn it into some kind of educational nonprofit? Use the profits to buy school supplies for your students? The group around us laughed, and I felt something crystallize inside me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold clarity. These people, my own family members and their friends, saw me as a joke. They viewed my career in education as somehow less valuable than Marcus's business pursuits, and my lifestyle choices as evidence of my inadequacy rather than my different values. You're probably right, I said finally, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. Eduardo's will should reflect his real priorities. Marcus nodded, clearly satisfied that he had put me in my place. Exactly, and his real priority was always making sure the business stayed strong. That means leaving it to people who can actually run it. I nodded as if I agreed with him, then excused myself to get some fresh air. I walked out onto the stone terrace that overlooked the vineyards, breathing in the crisp October air and trying to process what had just happened. The humiliation was familiar, an echo of countless childhood moments when Marcus had asserted his superiority while adults either ignored my discomfort or actively encouraged his behavior. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the finality of Eduardo's death, or maybe it was the particularly cruel nature of Marcus's public humiliation, but I found myself thinking about the envelope that had arrived at my apartment 3 days ago. The envelope I had been too emotional and overwhelmed to open, assuming it was just another sympathy card or routine communication from the family lawyer. The envelope that was currently sitting on my kitchen counter, sealed with red wax and bearing my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. The envelope that might contain something far more significant than a sympathy note. As I stood on the terrace watching the sunset paint the vineyards in shades of gold and amber, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would open that envelope. Tonight, I would let Marcus and his friends enjoy their certainty about the future. But tomorrow, we might all discover that Eduardo Castillo had been paying much closer attention than any of us realized. The reception continued around me, but I felt strangely detached from it all. I made the appropriate small talk, accepted condolences with grace, and played my role as the quiet, unremarkable granddaughter who knew her place in the family hierarchy. But underneath the surface, something had shifted. The humiliation I had just experienced felt like the final insult in a lifetime of being overlooked and underestimated. As I drove home to my small apartment that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Eduardo's eyes in those family portraits, the way they seemed to see everything, even when he said nothing. I thought about the way he used to watch me during family gatherings, his expression unreadable, but somehow knowing. I thought about the rare moments when he had acknowledged something I said or did, the brief flashes of what might have been approval or understanding. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe Eduardo had barely noticed me, barely considered me worthy of his legacy. But maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than any of us understood. Tomorrow, I would find out which version of reality was true. The envelope waited on my kitchen counter like a promise or a threat, its red wax seal catching the light from my small dining room lamp. I poured myself a glass of wine, ironically one of our own vintages, and sat at my tiny kitchen table staring at that envelope and wondering if my entire understanding of my place in the Castillo family was about to change forever. Outside my window, the lights of Sonoma twinkled in the distance, a world away from the grandeur of the family estate, but somehow more real, more authentically mine. Whatever that envelope contained, whatever Eduardo's will revealed, I knew that this was the moment when everything would shift. The question was whether it would shift in my favor or simply confirm what Marcus and the rest of my family had always believed about me. I went to bed that night with the envelope still unopened, but my dreams were filled with vineyards and red wax seals and the echo of my grandfather's voice saying words I could never quite make out. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Eduardo Castillo had seen me more clearly than anyone else ever had. I woke up the next morning with the weight of anticipation pressing against my chest like a physical force. The envelope sat exactly where I had left it on my kitchen counter, the red wax seal catching the morning light streaming through my small apartment windows. I had dreamed about it all night, vivid dreams where Eduardo's voice echoed through empty vineyard rows, speaking words I could never quite understand but felt in my bones were important. My hands trembled slightly as I made coffee, going through the familiar motions of my morning routine while my eyes kept drifting back to that sealed envelope. Part of me wanted to rip it open immediately, to finally know what Eduardo wanted to tell me that was important enough to send separately from whatever formal communications would come through the family lawyer. But another part of me was terrified that it would be nothing more than a sympathy note, a gesture that would ultimately change nothing about my position in the family hierarchy. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, but I knew I wouldn't be able to concentrate on teaching with this mystery hanging over me.
My principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, was understanding, as always. She had become something of a mentor to me over the years, one of the few people who seemed to truly value my dedication to education and my ability to connect with students who struggled academically or emotionally. After hanging up the phone, I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and stared at the envelope for what felt like hours. The handwriting was definitely Eduardo's, the same careful script I remembered from birthday cards and the occasional note he would leave around the house during family visits. But there was something different about this writing, something more deliberate and purposeful than his usual casual correspondence. Finally, I couldn't stand the suspense any longer. I carefully broke the wax seal, trying not to damage it completely because something told me this moment was historically significant, something I might want to preserve. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper, folded once. As I unfolded it, I immediately recognized Eduardo's letterhead, the elegant Castillo Vineyards logo embossed at the top. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Eduardo's death, which meant he had been planning this communication for some time. My heart rate accelerated as I began to read his familiar handwriting. "My dearest Sophia," the letter began, and I felt tears prick my eyes at the unexpected tenderness in those words. Eduardo had never called me dearest anything in person. If you are reading this, then I have passed on, and you are probably feeling confused and perhaps hurt by your family's treatment of you, especially at my funeral. I want you to know that I have been watching you much more closely than you realize, and I am more proud of the woman you have become than I ever expressed while I was alive. I had to pause reading because my hands were shaking so badly that the words were becoming blurry. This was not what I had expected. This was not the distant grandfather I thought I knew. I know that Marcus and your parents have made you feel like an outsider, like someone who doesn't belong in our family or deserve a share of what we have built. I want you to understand that their treatment of you says nothing about your worth and everything about their narrow understanding of what makes a person valuable. You have qualities that Marcus will never possess, qualities that are essential for truly understanding what Castillo Vineyards represents and what it could become in the right hands. My coffee grew cold as I continued reading, absorbing words that were rewriting my entire understanding of my relationship with Eduardo. I have watched you walk through our vineyard since you were a small child, and I have seen the way you connect with the land, the way you understand the soul of what we do here. Marcus sees numbers and profit margins. You see stories and heritage and the sacred responsibility of stewarding something that connects us to generations past and future. That is why I have made certain decisions regarding my estate that may surprise everyone, including you. The letter went on to explain that Eduardo had been quietly observing our family dynamics for years, noting the way Marcus was praised for mediocre business insights, while my deeper understanding of the vineyard's history and potential was ignored. He wrote about conversations he had overheard between my parents, discussions where they dismissed my intelligence and potential in ways that had disturbed him deeply. Your parents see your teaching career as a failure because it doesn't generate the kind of wealth and status they value, Eduardo wrote. They don't understand that your ability to nurture young minds, to help struggling students find their potential, to create positive change in your community, demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership qualities that Castillo Vineyards needs for its future. A business is only as strong as its values, and values are only as strong as the people who embody them. I was crying openly now. Years of feeling inadequate and overlooked beginning to dissolve under the weight of Eduardo's words. He had seen me. He had understood me. All those years when I felt invisible, he had been watching and appreciating qualities in me that no one else in the family seemed to notice or value. But it was the final paragraph that made me gasp out loud. Tomorrow, my lawyer will read my will to the family. I think you will find it very different from what Marcus and your parents are expecting. I have left you controlling interest in Castillo Vineyards, along with the main house and the majority of my personal assets. This is not a sentimental gesture or an attempt to be fair. This is a business decision based on my assessment of who is best equipped to honor what we have built while having the vision and values necessary to take it into the future. I read that paragraph 3 times before the words fully sunk in. Controlling interest. The main house. The majority of his assets. Eduardo hadn't just remembered me in his will. He had chosen me as his primary heir, the person he trusted most to carry on his legacy. I know that Marcus and your parents will be angry, and your parents will be confused. They have spent so many years underestimating you that they won't understand my decision initially. But you must remember that you have earned this responsibility through your character, your values, and your deep understanding of what really matters. Don't let them convince you that you don't deserve it or that you're not capable of handling it. The letter concluded with practical information. Eduardo had arranged for his personal lawyer, a man named Robert Chen, whom I had never met, to contact me directly after the will reading. Chen had been given detailed instructions about Eduardo's wishes and had been working with Eduardo for months to ensure that the transition of power would be as smooth as possible despite the family chaos it would inevitably create. Be strong, my dear granddaughter, Eduardo wrote in closing. You are more like me than anyone else in the family, and I trust you to make decisions that honor both our heritage and our responsibility to future generations. The vineyard needs someone who loves it for what it represents, not just what it can produce. You are that person. I spent the rest of the morning in my kitchen after finishing the letter, holding it in my hands and trying to process the magnitude of what Eduardo had revealed. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my place in it, about my grandfather's feelings toward me had been completely wrong. Eduardo hadn't been distant because he didn't care about me. He had been observing, evaluating, and ultimately making what he saw as the most important business decision of his life. The implications were staggering. If Eduardo's will really did leave me controlling interest in Castillo Vineyards, I would suddenly become one of the wealthiest people in Napa Valley. More than that, I would be responsible for a business that employed over 200 people and produced wines that were served in the finest restaurants around the world. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. But underneath the fear and shock, I felt something else growing, a sense of vindication that was almost intoxicating. Marcus's cruel words at the funeral reception, his assumption that I didn't deserve anything significant from Eduardo's estate, his public humiliation of me in front of family and friends, all of it was about to be revealed as the ignorant posturing of someone who had fundamentally misunderstood his own grandfather. I spent the rest of the morning researching everything I could find about Castillo Vineyard's current financial situation, something I had never bothered to investigate since I assumed it would never be relevant to my life. What I discovered was fascinating and somewhat troubling. The business was profitable, but it had been coasting on its reputation for the past several years without significant innovation or expansion. Marcus's involvement had been largely ceremonial, with the actual business operations being handled by a management team that Eduardo had assembled over the decades.
More concerning was what I found in industry publications about trends in the wine business. Smaller, boutique wineries were increasingly challenging established operations like ours by focusing on sustainable practices, unique varietals, and authentic storytelling that connected consumers to the land and the people behind the wine. Castillo Vineyards, despite its prestigious reputation, was beginning to look somewhat old-fashioned and disconnected from the values that younger wine consumers were seeking. This was exactly the kind of challenge that would play to my strengths rather than Marcus's. My background in education had taught me how to communicate complex ideas in accessible ways, how to build authentic relationships with diverse groups of people, and how to think creatively about solving problems. My love for the vineyard's history and my understanding of its deeper significance could be exactly what was needed to reposition Castillo Vineyards for the next generation of wine enthusiasts. By the time the afternoon arrived, I had moved from shock to excitement to a kind of nervous determination. If Eduardo had really chosen me to inherit the business, then I owed it to him and to myself to rise to the challenge. I had spent too many years accepting other people's assessment of my limitations. Maybe it was time to discover what I was actually capable of accomplishing. The phone rang around 3 o'clock, interrupting my research and planning. The caller ID showed my parents' home number, which meant either my mother or father was calling with news about the will reading that was scheduled for 4 o'clock that afternoon. "Sophia, honey?" My mother's voice sounded strained and artificial, the tone she used when she was trying to manage a situation she found uncomfortable. "I wanted to check in with you before we all meet at Mr. Peterson's office for the will reading." Mr. Peterson was the family's longtime lawyer, a man I had met only briefly at various family functions over the years. He was old-school Napa Valley establishment, someone who had handled Eduardo's legal affairs for decades and understood the intricacies of family business succession. "I'm fine, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral, looking forward to finally getting some clarity about Eduardo's wishes. "Well, yes, of course, we all are." She paused, and I could hear the carefully controlled concern in her voice. "I just wanted to make sure you understand that these situations can sometimes be emotional. Family dynamics, expectations, that sort of thing. I hope you won't take anything too personally if the distribution isn't exactly what you might have hoped for." I almost laughed at the irony of her warning. She was trying to prepare me for disappointment, to manage my expectations so that I wouldn't be too hurt when Eduardo's will confirmed what the family had always believed about my lesser status. She had no idea that I was sitting in my kitchen with a letter that suggested the exact opposite scenario was about to unfold. "I understand, Mom. I'll see you at Mr. Peterson's office." After hanging up, I realized that I needed to make a decision about how to handle the next few hours. I could arrive at the will reading as the same quiet, unassuming Sophia that everyone expected, allowing them to maintain their assumptions right up until the moment when Mr. Peterson read Eduardo's actual wishes. Or I could prepare them in some way, drop hints that might make the revelation less shocking. But as I thought about Marcus's behavior at the funeral reception, about the years of being dismissed and overlooked, about the cruel laughter of his friends when he suggested I didn't deserve any significant inheritance, I decided that they had earned the shock they were about to receive. They had chosen to see me as weak and irrelevant. They could live with the consequences of that choice. I did, however, decide to dress differently than I usually did for family events.
Instead of the modest, unmarkable clothing that had become my armor against their judgment, I chose a tailored black blazer that I had bought for parent-teacher conferences, paired with well-fitted dark jeans and low heels. I wasn't trying to compete with their designer wardrobes, but I wanted to look like someone who took herself seriously, someone who belonged in important conversations about business and family legacy. The drive to Mr. Peterson's office took me through the heart of Napa Valley, past vineyards and estates that represented generations of family wealth and tradition. I had driven this route countless times over the years, usually feeling like an outsider, observing a world that I could never fully belong to. But today, everything looked different. Today, I was driving toward a meeting that would determine whether I was about to become one of the most powerful people in this valley, or simply receive confirmation of my permanent status as the family disappointment. Mr. Peterson's office occupied a beautifully restored Victorian building in the center of St. Helena, the kind of establishment that communicated tradition, stability, and discretion through its understated elegance. I arrived exactly on time, my stomach churning with nerves, but my mind surprisingly clear about what I needed to accomplish in the next hour. The receptionist directed me to a conference room where the rest of my family was already gathered. Marcus sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, looking confident and relaxed in his expensive suit. My parents flanked him, my mother elegant in her grief attire, and my father projecting the kind of quiet authority he had cultivated through decades of business success. Several other relatives were present as well. Aunts and uncles and cousins who had varying degrees of involvement in the family business, but who all clearly expected to receive something from Eduardo's estate. The conversation died when I entered the room, and I felt the familiar weight of their collective assessment. But this time, instead of making me feel small and inadequate, their scrutiny felt almost amusing. They were looking at me and seeing exactly what they expected to see: the unremarkable granddaughter who would be grateful for whatever small bequest Eduardo had left her. None of them had any idea that everything they thought they knew was about to change. "Sophia," said Marcus with the kind of forced joviality that I now recognized as one of his tools for maintaining social dominance. "Glad you could make it."
I was just telling everyone how nice it was that Eduardo thought to include you in his will. It shows what a generous man he was. The condescension in his voice was so thick it was almost comical. He was already positioning Eduardo's inclusion of me as an act of charity rather than merit, setting up the narrative that would allow him to maintain his sense of superiority even if I received something more than a token bequest. "Yes," I said simply, taking a seat near the middle of the table. Eduardo was always very thoughtful about these things. Mr. Peterson entered the room a few minutes later, carrying a thick folder and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggested he understood the gravity of what he was about to reveal. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 70s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades handling the most sensitive affairs of wealthy families. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, settling himself at the opposite end of the table from Marcus. "Thank you all for being here today. I know this is a difficult time for the family, and I appreciate your patience as we work through Eduardo's final wishes." He opened the folder and withdrew a document that was much thicker than I had expected. Eduardo's will was apparently quite detailed, which suggested that he had given considerable thought to how he wanted his assets distributed. "Before I begin reading the will," Mr. Peterson continued, "I want to mention that Eduardo came to see me several times over the past year to discuss and revise his wishes. He was very specific about his reasoning for various decisions, and he asked me to convey to you that every provision in this document represents careful consideration of what he believed would be best for both the family and the business." I noticed Marcus shift slightly in his chair, his confident expression faltering just a bit. Maybe he was beginning to sense that this wasn't going to be the straightforward confirmation of his inheritance that he had expected. Eduardo's estate is substantial, including the vineyard operations, real estate holdings, investment accounts, and personal assets. The total value is estimated at approximately $47 million. A murmur went through the room at this figure, which was higher than anyone had expected. Eduardo had apparently been even more successful than we realized,
and the stakes of his inheritance decisions were correspondingly higher. "Now, let me read the relevant provisions of the will," Mr. Peterson said, adjusting his glasses and beginning to speak in the formal cadence that lawyers use for legal documents. The first several bequests were relatively small and unsurprising. Various relatives received amounts ranging from $50,000 to $200,000. My parents were left the smaller vineyard property that had been Eduardo's first acquisition, along with enough liquid assets to maintain it comfortably. These were generous gifts, but they represented a small fraction of Eduardo's total wealth. I watched Marcus's face as these preliminary bequests were read, seeing his confidence gradually return as it became clear that the major assets hadn't been addressed yet. He was obviously assuming that the big announcement was being saved for last, that Mr. Peterson was building up to the moment when Marcus would be revealed as the primary heir to Eduardo's empire. "Now, we come to the disposition of Castillo Vineyards itself," Mr. Peterson said, and the room fell completely silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the decision that would determine the future of the family business and establish the hierarchy for the next generation. "To my granddaughter, Sophia Elena Castillo, I leave controlling interest in Castillo Vineyards, consisting of 65% of all outstanding shares, along with the main house and grounds, and all associated business assets and operational equipment." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the ticking of the antique clock on Mr. Peterson's bookshelf. No one moved, no one spoke. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded, and everyone was still processing the blast. Marcus was the first to react, his face cycling rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. "That can't be right. There must be some mistake." Mr. Peterson continued reading as if Marcus hadn't spoken. "I make this bequest to Sophia Elena Castillo because she alone among my descendants has demonstrated the values, vision, and deep understanding of our family heritage that will be necessary to guide Castillo Vineyards into the future. Her dedication to education, her commitment to helping others reach their potential, and her authentic love for our land and our history make her the natural choice to carry on what we have built." My mother made a small gasping sound, as if the wind had been knocked out of her. My father sat frozen, staring at Mr. Peterson as if he could will the words to be different through sheer force of concentration. "To my grandson, Marcus David Castillo, I leave a 20% interest in Castillo Vineyards, along with a seat on the board of directors and a management position within the company, provided that he can work constructively with Sophia as the majority owner and primary decision-maker." 20%. After years of being groomed as the heir apparent, after assuming that he would inherit control of the family empire, Marcus had been left a minority stake that came with conditions about his ability to work cooperatively with me. The humiliation must have been devastating. "The remaining 15% of Castillo Vineyards shares are to be held in trust for future generations, with Sophia serving as the trustee responsible for determining how those shares will eventually be distributed." The room erupted into chaos. Marcus jumped to his feet, his face flush with rage. "This can't be impossible. Eduardo was losing his mental capacity toward the end. He couldn't have made a decision like this in his right mind." My father found his voice, though it sounded strained and bewildered. "There has to be some explanation. Eduardo knew that Marcus was being prepared to take over the business. This doesn't make any sense." My mother was crying quietly, though whether from grief, shock, or disappointment, I couldn't tell. Several of the relatives were speaking at once, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of confusion and protest. Through it all, I sat quietly. Eduardo's letter folded carefully in my purse, watching my family's reaction to discovering that everything they had believed about their futures had just changed forever. I felt sorry for them, genuinely sorry for the pain and confusion they were experiencing, but I also felt something I had never experienced before in relation to my family: power.
Peterson raised his hand for silence, and gradually the room quieted down. "I understand that this news is unexpected and emotionally difficult," he said, But I want to assure you that Eduardo was completely competent when he made these decisions. In fact, he anticipated that there might be questions about his mental state, which is why he had his physician conduct a thorough evaluation just 1 week before signing this will. Dr. Martinez's report confirms that Eduardo was in full possession of his faculties and completely capable of making informed decisions about his estate. Marcus slumped back into his chair, the reality of his situation beginning to sink in. He wasn't just disappointed. His entire life plan, his identity as the family heir, his vision of his future, had just been demolished in the space of 5 minutes. Furthermore, Mr. Peterson continued, Eduardo left detailed explanations for his major decisions, which I am authorized to share with you if you would like to share his reasoning more fully. Yes, my father said immediately. I want to hear exactly what Eduardo was thinking. Mr. Peterson opened another folder and withdrew several pages of Eduardo's handwriting. Eduardo wrote extensively about his observations of family dynamics over the years and his assessment of each potential heir's qualifications for inheriting the business. He began reading Eduardo's notes, and I realized that my grandfather had been conducting a kind of long-term evaluation of all of us, documenting our behaviors, our values, our treatment of others, and our understanding of what Castillo Vineyards really represented. About Marcus, Eduardo had written, Marcus has excellent business instincts and strong social skills, but he lacks the deeper understanding of our heritage and values that will be necessary for long-term success. He sees the vineyard as a profit center rather than a sacred trust. His treatment of Sophia and his assumption that wealth entitles him to superiority concern me greatly. A leader who cannot recognize talent and worth in unexpected places is not equipped to guide a family business through changing times. About me, Eduardo had written much more extensively. Sophia has been undervalued by the family because her strengths don't fit traditional business molds, but those very strengths are exactly what Castillo Vineyards needs for its future. Her work as an educator demonstrates her ability to nurture potential, communicate effectively, and maintain focus on long-term development rather than short-term gains. Her love for our land is authentic and deep. Her values align with what our family business should represent. Most importantly, she has developed strength and independence despite years of being dismissed and overlooked. This kind of resilience will be essential for the challenges ahead. As Mr. Peterson read these assessments, I watched my family's faces change. The initial shock and anger were giving way to a more complex mixture of emotions. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't a sentimental gesture or a mistake. Eduardo had made a calculated business decision based on years of careful observation. When Mr. Peterson finished reading, the room fell silent again. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice much quieter than before. So, what happens now? Mr. Peterson looked at me. That depends largely on Sophia. As the majority owner, she will need to decide how she wants to structure the leadership and operations of Castillo Vineyards going forward. All eyes turned to me, and I realized that this was the moment when I would either step into the role Eduardo had chosen for me or crumble under the pressure and expectations. I thought about the letter in my purse, about Eduardo's faith in my abilities, about all the years I had accepted other people's limitations on my potential. I think, I said slowly, that we all need some time to process this news before making any major decisions about the future. But I want everyone to know that I take this responsibility very seriously, and I hope we can find a way to work together as a family to honor Eduardo's legacy. It was a diplomatic response, but I could see that it wasn't what Marcus wanted to hear. He wanted me to immediately defer to his experience, to admit that I was overwhelmed and needed his guidance. But I wasn't going to do that. Eduardo had chosen me for reasons he believed were valid, and I owed it to him and to myself to at least try to live up to his expectations. The meeting concluded with arrangements for follow-up sessions to handle the practical details of transferring assets and updating legal documents. As people began filing out of the conference room, I found myself alone with Marcus for a moment. "This isn't over, Sophia," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of hurt and determination. "Eduardo may have lost perspective toward the end,
but the family knows who's really qualified to run this business. Don't think you can just step into his shoes because of some sentimental bequest." I looked at him steadily. Eduardo didn't make sentimental decisions, Marcus. He made business decisions, and apparently he decided that I was the best choice for the future of Castillo Vineyards. As I walked out of Mr. Peterson's office and into the late afternoon sunshine, I felt like I was stepping into an entirely different life. The woman who had woken up that morning as a high school teacher living in a small apartment was now the majority owner of a $47 million wine empire. The transformation was so complete and sudden that it felt almost surreal. But as I drove home through the vineyards that were now mine, I also felt the weight of Eduardo's expectations settling on my shoulders. He had seen something in me that even I wasn't sure I possessed. The question now was whether I could rise to meet his faith in my abilities, or whether Marcus and the rest of my family would ultimately be proven right about my limitations. Either way, tomorrow would bring challenges I had never imagined facing. Tonight, I would try to wrap my mind around the fact that my entire life had just changed forever. 3 months later, I stood in Eduardo's forward office, now mine, watching the sunrise paint the vineyards in shades of gold and crimson. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the estate, illuminating the mahogany desk where Eduardo had made countless decisions that shaped not just our family business, but the entire Napa Valley wine industry. Today, I would be making my own history-changing decision. The transition hadn't been smooth. Marcus had spent the first month after the will reading attempting to rally family members and business associates against my leadership, arguing that Eduardo's choice had been influenced by declining mental capacity, despite Dr. Martinez's clear assessment to the contrary. He had scheduled meetings with our distributors, reached out to industry publications, and even hired his own lawyer to explore options for contesting the will. But what Marcus hadn't anticipated was how quickly I would adapt to my new role, or how enthusiastically the vineyard's employees would embrace my leadership style. Where Eduardo had been distant and formal, I was accessible and collaborative.
Where Marcus had treated the workers as interchangeable labor, I took time to learn their names, their concerns, and their insights about improving our operations. The real turning point had come 6 weeks ago when I announced my vision for transforming Castillo Vineyards into a model of sustainable agriculture and social responsibility. Instead of simply maintaining our reputation for premium wines, we would become leaders in environmental stewardship, worker welfare, and community engagement. It was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that the industry needed, and exactly the kind of values-based leadership that Eduardo had recognized in me. My desk phone rang, interrupting my morning reflection. Robert Chen, Eduardo's personal attorney who had become my trusted advisor, was calling with the news I had been expecting. "Good morning, Sophia. The papers are finalized. Marcus has officially agreed to sell his 20% stake back to the company." I smiled, feeling a mixture of relief and satisfaction. "And the price?" "Exactly what we discussed. Fair market value plus a premium for the family connection. He'll walk away with nearly $12 million, enough to start his own venture if he chooses." The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus, who had assumed he deserved to inherit control of a $47 million empire based on his gender and birth order, was now accepting what amounted to a generous severance package for his years of minimal contribution to the family business. But I felt no malice toward him anymore, only a kind of sad understanding of how limited his vision had always been. "Has he signed everything?" "This morning, his lawyer delivered the documents an hour ago. Marcus is officially out of the wine business, and you now own 85% of Castillo Vineyards outright." After hanging up with Robert, I walked out onto the stone terrace where I had once stood feeling like an outsider at my own grandfather's funeral reception. The view was the same, but everything else had changed. The vineyard workers I could see in the distance weren't anonymous employees anymore. They were Maria, who had 3 grandchildren and 20 years of experience with our Pinot Noir vines. They were Carlos, who had innovative ideas about organic pest management that we were implementing across the property. They were Elena, whose family had worked our land for 4 generations and who knew more about the soil conditions in each vineyard block than any agricultural consultant ever could. This personal connection to the people who made our success possible was something Marcus had never understood, something my parents had dismissed as sentimental rather than strategic. But it was the foundation of everything I was building at Castillo Vineyards. Eduardo had been right to recognize that sustainable business success required authentic relationships and shared values, not just efficient profit extraction. My phone buzzed with a text message from my former teaching colleague, Sarah, who had become one of my closest confidants during the transition. Saw the article in Wine Spectator about your sustainability initiatives? You're officially famous now. Coffee later to celebrate? The Wine Spectator article had been a major milestone, a 3-page feature story about the transformation happening at Castillo Vineyards under my leadership. The journalist had been particularly impressed with our new employee profit-sharing program, our commitment to carbon-neutral operations by next year, and our partnership with local schools to provide agricultural education programs. The article positioned us as innovators who are redefining what it meant to be a prestigious winery in the 21st century. More importantly, the article had generated interest from distributors and restaurants who wanted to work with companies that aligned with their customers' values. Our sales had increased by 30% since I took over, with particularly strong growth in markets that prioritized sustainability and social responsibility. Eduardo's faith in my business instincts was being validated by results that spoke louder than any family politics. A soft knock on the office door interrupted my thoughts. Vanessa Martinez, who had been Eduardo's executive assistant and had chosen to stay on with me, entered carrying a thick folder and wearing the kind of expression that suggested important news. "The final numbers from the Morgan acquisition are in," she said, setting the folder on my desk. "It's official. We now own the largest contiguous organic vineyard operation in Napa Valley." The Morgan acquisition had been my boldest move as the new owner of Castillo Vineyards. When Thomas Morgan, a neighboring vintner, had approached me about selling his property due to his retirement, I had seen an opportunity to dramatically expand our sustainable agriculture operations while preserving farmland that might otherwise be developed into luxury housing. The purchase had required leveraging a significant portion of our assets and taking on debt that made my parents nervous and had given Marcus ammunition for his arguments against my leadership. But the results spoke for themselves. The expanded vineyard allowed us to control our entire supply chain, experiment with new sustainable growing techniques, and position ourselves as the premier organic wine producer in the region. "The Morgan family wants to host a celebration dinner next weekend," she said. "They're inviting some of the most influential people in the valley, food writers, restaurant owners, other winery families. It'll be a good opportunity to showcase what we've accomplished." I nodded, already thinking about how to use the event to solidify relationships with key industry figures. The old Sophia would have been intimidated by the prospect of networking with influential strangers. The new Sophia, the one who had survived family betrayal and built a thriving business empire, was looking forward to it. After Vanessa left, I opened the folder containing the Morgan acquisition details and marveled at how much my life had changed since that devastating text message about Christmas dinner. I owned nearly 2,000 acres of prime Napa Valley land, employed over 300 people, and was being recognized as one of the most innovative leaders in the wine industry. More importantly, I had built something that aligned with my values and made a positive impact on my community. The intercom on my desk buzzed. "Sophia, your parents are here to see you." I hadn't spoken to my parents since a tense family dinner 2 months ago, where they had tried to convince me to give Marcus a larger role in the company. The conversation had ended with my father suggesting that I was letting success go to my head, and my mother worrying about what people would think about our family's internal conflicts. I had remained polite but firm in my position that Eduardo had chosen me to lead Castillo Vineyards, and I intended to honor that responsibility. "Send them in," I said, straightening my shoulders and preparing for whatever conversation was about to unfold. My parents entered the office looking older and more subdued than I remembered. The past few months had clearly been difficult for them, watching their assumptions about family hierarchy and Marcus's future crumble, while their previously overlooked daughter transformed into a powerful business leader. "Sophia, dear," my mother said, her voice carrying a careful tone that suggested she had rehearsed this conversation. "You look wonderful. The business suits you." My father remained standing near the door, his expression unreadable. "We heard about Marcus selling his shares," he said without preamble. "We wanted to make sure you're making decisions for the right reasons." I gestured toward the chairs in front of my desk, maintaining the polite but professional demeanor I had developed for difficult family conversations.
What reasons would those be? Not vindictiveness, my mother said quickly. We know there have been hurt feelings, misunderstandings, but Marcus is still your brother. This business has always been about family. The irony of her concern for family unity wasn't lost on me. When Marcus had publicly humiliated me at Eduardo's funeral, when they had spent decades dismissing my potential, when they had made me feel like an outsider in my own family, there had been no concern about hurt feelings or misunderstandings. But now that Marcus was experiencing consequences for his behavior, suddenly family harmony was a priority. Marcus chose to sell his shares, I said calmly. He felt he couldn't work constructively within the structure that Eduardo established. I respected his decision and made sure he received fair compensation for his stake in the company. My father sat down heavily, looking every one of his 72 years. We failed you, didn't we? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of pain and disappointment. I could have been cruel. I could have itemized every slight, every dismissal, every moment when they had chosen Marcus's mediocrity over my potential. But looking at their faces, seeing genuine remorse and confusion, I found that I didn't want to cause them more pain. You made choices based on what you thought was best at the time, I said carefully. Those choices had consequences. But Eduardo saw something in me that you missed, and now we all have to live with the results of his decision. He was right, my mother said quietly, tears starting to form in her eyes. About you, about your potential, about what you could accomplish. We were so focused on traditional expectations that we couldn't see who you really were. My father nodded slowly. The sustainability initiatives, the community partnerships, the employee programs, you've done things with this company that Marcus never would have thought of, things that Eduardo would have been proud of. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to receive from them, and I felt some of the old hurt beginning to soften. They weren't evil people. They weren't intentionally cruel. They had simply been limited by their own experiences and assumptions, unable to recognize value that didn't fit their preconceived notions. I appreciate you saying that, I said, and I hope we can build a better relationship going forward. My mother reached across the desk and took my hand. We'd like that very much. And Sophia, about Christmas this year, we were hoping you might join us, all of us, as a family. I thought about the Christmas dinner I had been excluded from, about the text message that had started this entire journey of transformation and discovery. The invitation felt like a symbolic completion of the circle, a recognition of my place in the family that had been so long denied. I'd like that, I said, and meant it. After my parents left, I returned to the terrace to watch the afternoon light change across the vineyards. In a few hours, the workers would finish their tasks for the day and head home to their families. The vines would settle into the quiet rhythms of growth and rest that have continued for generations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that Eduardo's faith in me had been justified. My phone buzzed with another text message, this one from Robert Chen. Congratulations on becoming the sole controlling owner of Castillo Vineyards. Eduardo would be proud. Also, I have something that belonged to him that he wanted you to have. Can you stop by my office this week? I smiled, wondering what final gift Eduardo had arranged for me. But whatever it was, I knew I was ready for it. I had survived family betrayal, built a thriving business, and discovered strengths I never knew I possessed. I had proven that Eduardo's unconventional choice had been exactly right. As the sun set over the vineyards that were now truly mine, I thought about the woman I had been 9 months ago, sitting in a small apartment and wondering if she would ever find her place in the world. That woman could never have imagined standing here now, confident and successful, and finally completely home. The transformation hadn't just been about money or power or family dynamics. It had been about discovering who I really was when I stopped accepting other people's limitations on my potential.
Eduardo had seen that possibility in me before I could see it in myself, and his faith had given me the courage to become the person I was always meant to be. Tomorrow, I would continue building on the foundation he had left me. But tonight, I would simply stand in the vineyard he had entrusted to my care and appreciate how far I had traveled from that devastating text message to this moment of quiet triumph. Sometimes, the most powerful seat isn't at someone else's table. Sometimes it's the one you build yourself, surrounded by people who recognize your worth and supported by your own unshakable belief in what you can accomplish. Eduardo had taught me that lesson through his final gift, and it was one I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.